Welcome to Robert E. Howard Days, everybody. 2022. Boy, talk about a long time to get here. Thank you so much for showing up to this. My name is Mark Finn, and I'm going to be moderating this panel. I'm pretty excited because I'm not going to talk much, which is rare. It's scarce, and I'm glad there's photographs here so people can say, yeah, he didn't say much. What I'd like us to do before we get started is to introduce ourselves very briefly, since we have enough people here for a rugby match. And we'll talk a little bit about what our connection to gaming with Robert E. Howard and Howard Properties is. And then we'll get into the fun stuff. So can we start down here with Fred?
Sure. I'm Fred Malmberg. I happen to be this year's guest of honor, which is fun, and very grateful for that. And thank you. I encountered fantasy through gaming, and I came to spend my life so far working. I started a games company back when I was a teenager in the 70s, and I spent a year interning at various American game companies, which we'll probably go through some of the stuff that they were working on. And yeah, I've been stuck in that industry ever since. I moved from Sweden to here 20 years ago. So now I'm dual citizen, happy to be here in Cross Plains. Thank you.
Nice. All right. Hello, I'm Bill Cavalier from Michigan City, Indiana. And woo! Shout out to Indiana there. And I have been a fan of Robert E. Howard since 1966, and I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons since 1978. So the Howard influence on Dungeons and Dragons, that's what I'm going to talk about, and it's deep, wide, and very prominent, as you're going to find out. So pass this along. Oh, there we go.
So I am Jason Ray Carney. I am a English professor at Christopher Newport University in Virginia, and I teach popular literature and really into pulp fiction and that sort of stuff. Robert E. Howard, of course. But probably the reason why I am a academic studying popular literature is because I got into it through gaming. My grandmother in 1992 bought me a board game called Hero Quest, and there's the Les Edwards cover of this giant barbarian that is not Conan, but is pretty much Conan, you know. And anyhow, gaming, reading fantasy fiction, and they're like part of the same enterprise for me. So happy to be here.
Hi, my name is Joel Bylos. I've come here from Oslo, Norway. I originally am from Australia, but I've lived in Norway for 15 years. And for most of that 15 years, I've been working on the Conan games that have been released by Funcom, so the video games. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that. My first experience with Conan is not as exciting as other people's. It's just my sister had a giant poster of Arnie on her bedroom wall because she really liked Arnold back in the day. But over the years, I've come to love all of Howard's work, really, but Conan is the one that I've been very focused on, so yeah.
Hi, Matt John. I've worked on several Conan games for a couple of different publishers, mostly Monolith, which is an ongoing game, new stuff coming out. Cut my teeth on D&D and also Hero Quest with that immortal Les Edwards artwork, so yeah, happy to be here. It's my first Howard Days.
I'd love, show of hands real quick. If this is your first Howard Days, raise your hand. Wow. Yeah, all right. There's a lot of gaming nerds here. This is awesome. Okay, well, let's get the ball rolling because it really kind of starts with Dungeons and Dragons. And that's Bill's forte. Andy, what do you got for us?
Well, you know, I wrote an article for Knights of the Dinner Table, the comic magazine that is devoted to gaming. Some of you are familiar with that. And I wrote an article about how Robert E. Howard influenced the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. But I have to go back even a little bit farther, because while Howard didn't influence, well, he did influence gaming, but his first influence in gaming was with, I can read you a quote. This is what Gary Gygax wrote in Shadis magazine. He said, "Fantasy wargaming began before adventure gaming. In fact, it began before chainmail. Tony Bath of England was conducting tabletop battles roughly based on the Hyborian age of Robert E. Howard's Conan years before the fantasy supplement of Chainmail was published," and that was in 1971. So we have to give Tony Bath props for recognizing the gameability of Robert E. Howard. But Mr. Gygax was a very prominent exponent of Robert E. Howard influencing Dungeons and Dragons. I actually got to speak with him live and in person. I had been going to Gen Con since 1980, and in the early years of Gen Con, it was on a college campus, and he was very accessible as far as he would walk around and just hang out with everybody. The attendance was only about 1,500 people, so he would just come and hang around and sit down and play games with people. And I knew he was a fan of Robert E. Howard, and so one day I just sat down and we started talking about Robert E. Howard. And I wish I had written some of this down, but I didn't. But he readily agreed to the influence of Robert E. Howard, how Howard helped him influence, helped him create Dungeons and Dragons. And I can read you another quote here as soon as I can find it. I can tell you. Gary Gygax originally read The Hour of the Dragon in the known press editions in the 1950s. And he did say that changed the way he looked at fantasy for the rest of his life. And so as he created Dungeons and Dragons, he drew upon Robert E. Howard's Conan as an example of some of the player characters. And also the co-creator of Dungeons and Dragons was a fellow named Dave Arneson. Now I tied him down a little more, and I tried to get an exact quote from him, and I did, about how Howard had influenced the creations of D&D. And he said, I asked him what was the influence of Robert E. Howard over helping you create D&D, and he said it was the looting, pillaging, and killing aspects of Conan, and it was also the hero fighting critters. Well, that pretty much describes Dungeons and Dragons, I think, but I do have to say that, and of course, I can back up a little bit. There is the infamous Appendix N in the back of the Dungeon Master's Guide, and all through the incarnations of D&D, first edition, second edition, AD&D, and anytime Gygax had anything to do with writing about D&D, he would always mention Robert E. Howard's Conan. And Appendix N is in the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide, and what that is just, it's a list of all the literary influences that helped Gygax create Dungeons and Dragons. And I think there's like 40 of them, but there are 7 that are most prominent, and Robert E. Howard is one of those 7. Specifically, Robert E. Howard's Conan. Mr. Gygax loved Robert E. Howard. He loved Conan, so that was pretty much the genesis. And And then they kept building on that, and of course, as we know, the game developed into really into what it is now. But you still have to go back to your roots, and when you go back to the roots of the creations of Dungeons and Dragons, you will find Robert E. Howard. Robert E. Howard was the only author cited by both Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax as help to create Dungeons and Dragons. Dave Arneson said, I asked him directly about Howard's influence. He said, well, I was sitting around one day and I was doodling on some graph paper and I was eating popcorn and watching Godzilla movies and I was reading Conan novels. And he said it all just kind of came out of that. But he specifically said he was reading Conan novels. Well, this would have been in the very early 70s. The only Conan novels available then were the Lancer editions. So there's proof that Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax used Robert E. Howard to create the massive industry of role-playing gaming. So that's pretty much all I got. We can move along now.
Well, TSR was very quick early on to capitalize on the success of their game, and it started early on with them trying to shoehorn more Howard stuff in. One of the earliest articles in one of the earliest Dragon magazines involves somebody writing up the Barbarian as a playable character class, and they tried several different iterations of this before they eventually just added it into the game instead of an optional thing, and it's been there ever since. Now the Barbarian in 5th edition doesn't really resemble Conan over much, probably for a number of copyright and trademark infringement reasons, but the fact that they, at least initially, were really interested in doing a Barbarian separate from a fighter because they recognized that, you know, Conan does things a little differently. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And they actually did some modules, some adventures set for Dungeons and Dragons using Conan. This was around the time of the Destroyer. So they had photos of Schwarzenegger on the cover. And the modules themselves kind of talked about, here's all the things you have to kind of not use if you're going to play Conan. And I don't know who did it. I think it might have been Zeb Cook that originally just said, why don't we just do a Conan game? Let's just do that. And so the Conan RPG was one of the first things that was dedicated, you know, to Howard's world and setting, and it was really good. The system now has got a lot of fans. Back then, the problem with it for most people my age was that it wasn't Dungeons and Dragons, and that was its only real sin. Yes.
So we probably shouldn't stay too much in ancient history, but my first encounter, or where I ended up as an intern, was with a company called the Chaosium, which had just published RuneQuest. And I was lucky enough to rent a room with Steve and Louise Perrin. I rented a little room, and I interned for Chaosium and play-tested Call of Cthulhu and other games. But how I got to know Greg Stafford, who created the company, was because I was importing his White Bear and Red Moon wargame, and that was the first time somebody, to me, had explored a fantasy world in a board game format, and it was just fascinating. What I found out later, much later, in fact only last year or the year before, when he passed, was that when he was, right before he created the Chaosium, he was either going to be a carpenter or he would do a game company. And this is in the Bay Area. And I actually happen to own an Intarsia. He carved out in wood a large map of the Hyborian Age. And each country, and it's meticulously done, and he signed it in 73 or 74, so just before he decided to, I'm not going to do this carpentry stuff, I'm going to do this game company. So I think we have Howard to, he probably felt, no, too much work to do these Intarsia Hyborian things. I'll do games instead.
Wow. Is the map still around?
The map is in my home office.
Oh, nice. All right. We'll be right over.
So what came after that? I mean, we had the Conan TSR game for a while, and then GURPS a few years after that did a Conan supplement, and all of these I kind of want to say this because it's going to come up later. All of these were using material based on what I'm going to call the saga, the 12 books with the stuff that DeCamp added in, along with the existing Howard stories.
12 Lancer books. You meant.
Yeah.
Make that distinction.
I should say the 12 Lancer. Well, the Ace reprinted them too, right?
Well,
They had all those. Yeah. Anyways, and GURPS Conan actually even pulled some of the pastiche novels in as well because they needed material for adventures and stuff like that, and so
I believe Elswag de Camp wrote the introduction to the GURPS game.
I've blocked that. I don't remember.
Sorry.
No,
Don't
it's
throw
okay.
anything at me.
Oh yeah, and Jason's got up on the screen these solo games that you could play. That was kind of a big deal. Chaosium did some of them. They were literally adult versions.
I think they were TSR.
These are
Yeah,
TSR.
that's TSR. Yeah.
Oh no, I meant the other ones.
Yeah.
The go back.
Yeah, the GURPS ones.
Oops. Okay, we got Royal Armies.
We skipped that one. Yeah, I know. There.
There, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Those are. Yeah, those GURPS are standalone games. They're basically very adult versions of the Choose Your Own Adventure books, right? Where you're on your own, or the Fighting Fantasy books, where you're supposed to tally off your own hit points and don't go look at the other thing to do. Yeah, those were fun. But that was mostly stuff that came out in the mid to late 80s and early 90s, and then things got kind of quiet for a few years.
Except for Hall of Volta, I think. Joel, did you ever play Hall of Volta?
Yeah, so Hall of Volta, I did play it, but actually only last year. Because I made a point of going back and playing every Conan game. I think, though, if you've made this, I think there's a game you're missing that was, it's not a Conan game, it's just called Barbarian. But how many people have played Barbarian?
I remember.
It's
I
extreme.
don't remember Hall of Volta.
Yeah, Hall of Volta was bad.
Yeah.
Barbarian is an amazing game, and that's basically, they may as well have called it Conan, right? It's two guys facing off in a pit with a princess up top and a wizard watching, right? And you just fight through these levels over and over. And the thing that was really cool about that game was that I think it established the visceral tone, like you can decapitate people, I think, for the first time in that game. Like, and it's if you manage to do the decapitation move, the guy just dies, and then like his servant walks on screen, kicks the head away, and drags the body off.
Wow.
Very, very cool. Very, very detailed.
Wow.
In 8-bit graphics back in the day. Beautiful stuff. And it had a great soundtrack. It actually had one of the best soundtracks I can remember from the C64 era.
That's
So
awesome. That's funny. They didn't do a 8-bit Basil Polidorus or anything like that.
no,
Okay.
it has a bit of that flavor to it though.
Okay.
It's not bad. It's
Cool.
not bad.
Very cool. And that was that a computer game?
Yeah, that was a computer game.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Commodore 64.
Or 64,
probably
not
I think you can probably get it on PC as well. Early PC game as
Yeah.
well. Like yeah.
But I think you're touching on something which is interesting because there are the older gamers like me and Indy that were kind of
Speak for yourself.
tabletop people, and then there was a shift in the 80s when we kind of kept going with our tabletop and paper RPGs, and And the first wave of video games was Atari, ColecoVision. They went away, and then that was the golden time for role-playing publishers around the world to actually aim straight for the middle graders. Here's paper stuff, because there was no competition. What happened was in 1986, when Nintendo brought out this new machine, we had very tough times recruiting kids into paper games, because they saw something much more flashy, much cooler, more accessible. And then I think some of us older gamers came back to video gaming through the computer games, when the PC became a good platform. But that was later. That was not until, I would say, mid-90s, with the mods and stuff.
It took a while for the video games and the computer games to catch up, because what you could do at a table with imagination and a limitless special effects budget, you were limited by the amount of memory that you had, and so sometimes it was an either or choice, or sometimes it was what if I don't want to do either one, and so for a while adventure gaming like that was pretty unsatisfying. It took a while to catch up to that.
Yeah, 100%. It's because the first games people were trying to recreate the tabletop experience as well. They were trying to bring over tabletop gaming into like digital spaces, and play on their own, because that's what we do. We're very lonely people on video games. but it was they were trying to recreate complex rule sets. Computers weren't fast enough. I mean, I don't know if anyone remembers, but in the 80s at least, the games that I played on my Commodore 64, they didn't have space on the disk for text, so you had a book beside it that you would read. It'd be like, go to journal entry 67, and then you'd open the book, and I kind of miss that. It had a very tabletop feel to it, right? And I think that Howard's influence on all of those, and I think it comes back to that as well. Like I mentioned, Barbarian, Volta. Like there's a lot of these sort of muscle men games. Masters of the Universe was one that was very popular, right? Where you played as He-Man, who's obviously a Conan analog. So yeah, it's but they were trying to recreate tabletop. They were trying to bring that feeling. But I do think it's very interesting that Conan's first real game was not an RPG on computers. It was definitely an action game, which I think is interesting.
Yeah. So, what's
Just before we move into modern Conan gaming, Larry Elmore at GaryCon was talking about Larry Elmore is one of the best Dungeons & Dragons artists of all time, right? And he was talking about his move to fantasy, right? Like his attempt to start drawing dragons and wizards and stuff. And he cites the Lancer Conans as his inspiration. He said he started painting before he read the books, right? So he said he saw these Frazetta covers and just was blown away. But when he was talking about his inspiration for his Dungeons & Dragons art, Conan comes up a lot. I thought that was interesting.
So the 90s were kind of sort of a dead zone for a lot of Robert E. Howard properties. There wasn't much happening at that point. But I think one of the first licenses that popped that I saw that kind of kickstarted things again, I shouldn't say kickstarted, this was 20 years before that, was the Conan game that Mongoose put out. Was there something before that? Am I misremembering, or was
GURPS and then that, right?
Yeah, after GURPS there was a little pause, and then we got Mongoose's Conan. And what was nice about Mongoose was they had licensed the open source Dungeons and Dragons rules. So this was the first time that there was an analog or a synergy between what was D&D at the time and now, Howard's Worlds. And that system was really popular. It got a lot of people in.
I loved the implementation of D20 to the Conan flavor. That's kind of how I ended up being here. I started a group on Facebook originally called Conan RPG Players, which I later called Conan Gaming Group. But it was because I loved that game so much, and there wasn't. I kind of get into it toward the end when it was hard to get that second edition book. Yeah, which famously kind of fell apart. The bindings had issues. But that was a big one for me with the massive damage rule.
Mm-hmm.
So contrary to other 3.5 where you made these superheroes who were indestructible, even in that game when you got high level, one shot could put you down.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of important to keep that deadliness in there.
And there was also a spin-off from this because of the popularity of that system. They also later did a Solomon Kane game where you got to, fight pirates and vampires at the same time in the jungles. And then that game world got adapted to another system called Savage Worlds, which is kind of interesting that they ported over the content rather than the system itself. I thought that was kind of cool. This is one of the, I think Solomon Kane, from a pop culture standpoint, this is where Solomon Kane starts to kind of come into his own as a character at this time, because we've had Solomon Kane in a lot of different iterations, more so than we have with some of the other Conan or Robert E. Howard properties. I mean, that's been right up to and including the board game that just recently showed up at my door, and I thought I had ordered a washer and dryer. Damn thing's enormous. Yes, Jason?
Just a brief comment. Solomon Kane is in fantasy gaming through the Witchfinders in Warhammer Fantasy. It's like that he was, I don't know, it's just 100% citation of Robert E. Howard, if you know that game and those characters. You can argue with me if you want, but there's Solomon Kane.
I'm down. So that was actually, all of this was happening in the early 2000s. This, I think, leads us up to, yeah. Are you ready? Hit it.
Well, I have 3 copies of this game.
I can do a segue intro for Joel, because
Yes.
this was a game which was actually being negotiated, the deal for it, with Infogrames, a French video game maker, when we were just acquiring the estate.
Okay.
And it was a done deal, and yet not. So it moved over to a company called TDK, and TDK was part of, they had a US TDK as well. It was part of the big TDK corporation, and the head of it was a German gentleman who was a die-hard Arnold Schwarzenegger fan. And at that time, we really tried to move away from the Arnold imagery. So it was like a constant battle between me and him, and me and him. Because of course, with video game manufacturing, they always miss deadlines. And so a very good way to renegotiate deals is to sort of say, okay, you get another year's extension. If not, then they come back. And it's like, oh, okay, what can we do? Now we cut away movie rights. Now we cut away. But it was actually very painful, because he was super passionate about the Conan he wanted to make. And I'll leave it to Joel to comment on the gameplay there.
Well, of course I'm biased, but I played it quite a lot. I played it through probably 3 times, and it's like it has some very first of all, I think it uses the movie music quite a bit, so it has a very authentic soundtrack, which is very nice.
And I think it was dubbed to various languages, and the German voice is the dubber for Arnold Schwarzenegger.
And they tried very hard to make sure that the locations felt iconic, and you really do get some of the sense, especially as you're slogging through the snow, and in the Pictish swamps which they have in the game. It's quite a good representation of sort of like a rock tour of Hyboria. Like, let's jump around to different places, but the story itself is relatively nonsensical, and the gameplay was really badly hindered by a terrible camera, sadly. So the controls themselves and the way you fight, they're okay, but the camera is so bad that it makes the experience just fall apart for you, sadly. But it's an interesting game because it feels like such a mashup of, like, it's almost like a popular look at Howard influences of Conan. It's like it's like viewing it through not through the lens of Howard, but for how people have seen different things made by people who've been influenced by Howard. Right. That's what it feels more like.
It's pop culture Conan rather than Howard Conan. And that we make that distinction a lot here. There's pop culture Conan, and then there's Howard's Conan.
Right. So it definitely has that lens.
Totally. Okay. Was that?
This was a pretty cool game, and it could have been even better, because at this point, this is like 2005, I think, and we were already working with Joel's company for the MMORPG, the Age of Conan, which was going to be the big, massively multiplayer online universe, but this would be a standalone fighting game. And THQ, an LA-based company, I was out there. We got a top producer, and they were going to spend a big budget with a top developer, and everything was moving very well. They also got a great composer. He went on to score, I think, God of War, Mike Regan. So everything was lined up to do a really great game until THQ got a new boss, and all of a sudden it's like, why are we going to pay royalty for this? Why are we doing a Conan game? We had a signed deal. So all of a sudden we just said, no, we're not going to do this Conan game, and you are in breach of contract because you've got this Funcom company doing a game. And we had a quibble, and we had to bring in the lawyers, and of course they thought, well, we have 6 in-house lawyers. These guys aren't going to give up. And what was sad, though, was that the marching orders to the developer, Nihilistic, up in the Bay Area, was take out everything that is Robert E. Howard's Conan, that can be trademarks or copyrights, and just make it a generic barbarian game, which they started to do. And then 6 months later, when the we've got company. When the deal was done, and they realized we should really release this as Conan because we should. And they should, and they did, but they had to capitalize at that point on the release of the Funcom MMO Age of Conan. So they kind of just bootstrapped the rest of the production, and it came out, and I think it would be interesting to hear if somebody played it, but I think it has some hints of the greatness it could have had.
Yeah, I don't remember that coming out because my enthusiasm was overshadowed by Age of Conan. That was the thing that absolutely, I think all of us were like stoked. Finally we were going to get a Conan game that other people could play at the same time, that was grounded with all these great locations, and you can choose what you want to be, and I mean, dude.
And it got mentioned on Big Bang Theory.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Sheldar the Barbarian.
And it had a Playboy special.
Yeah, I know the artist who did that, and he enjoyed it way too much. Have you ever met Vebjørn? No. Oh, we'll have beers with him next time you're in Norway. You'll enjoy that. Sorry, before we jump to Age of Conan, let me talk about the THQ one a little bit. I did play this a lot. You played it too, from what I understood. They're going for the God of War style gameplay. I think God of War had come out the year before. I think God of War had beaten it out, and they were going for that style of gameplay. But the thing about God of War was that it was extremely tight on the control side, and it was a very focused game on they were kind of like, oh, we're doing a rock tour of Greek mythology, right? And this felt very disjointed. And Ron Perlman, I love his voice, but he sort of phoned it in, I think, a bit on the voiceover on this one. He wasn't the greatest Conan that I've heard.
I would say, from my standpoint, it was interesting that you had those two titles kind of floating around at the same time, because this one catered to a different kind of gamer than the MMO. MMOs are big, crunchy, time commitment games. This was fast action, and no, it was imperfect, but it was a fun game. And one thing I hear a lot in Conan gaming is you hear from the different folks who they do want a verbose kind of game, but you also hear from those who want an action adventure game as well. So it was an interesting time that you had the two concurrently.
I just have a question. I think the Age of Conan novels, they came out before the MMO was released, because I remember being confused because I was all excited about like Age of Conan, and I think I thought this was Age of Conan at one point because I was reading the novels, and then I got this game and I'm like, I don't think this is it. But
Yeah, that is also, you learn as you live, right? When I've got the perfect plan, we've got, these guys are going to make novels, huge deal, we got the greatest cover artist, these guys are going to make the game, let's make sure we have characters that aren't Conan. We're not going to write these books about Conan, but about characters and locations that feature in the game. And then we can do other things. We can also have the comic book line. It was all planned out lovely. And then, of course, the Funcom guys say, wow, World of Warcraft just raised the stakes here. So we have to put in a couple of 100 people and 2 more years and make this $5 million game a $45 million game. So we're going to push the release until 2007, let's say. Meanwhile, that's not how the book industry works. They're like, no, we are releasing because this is the schedule and this is what we do. Great team. They were the old Ace team, actually, over at Penguin, and Ginger Buchanan has been a big support. But, so they released these books, and there was nothing to support them. It was very sad, but these things happen.
Ironically, though, maybe fortuitously, when I was writing quests for Age of Conan, I was using those books for reference to make those characters more interesting in the game. So, it paid off on some level for us.
I remember seeing the characters from the novels in the game, and I was like,
So when this thing hit like a tidal wave. I mean, there was a deluxe presentation, which was great because it actually included Paul Salmon's, like an excerpted thing from his book that sort of talked about Robert E. Howard's Conan, which is nice. This was what's cool about this is probably in a way that I don't think any other project has done. This put Howard's name front and center for millions of people who previously only knew of Conan and not Robert E. Howard. And so it was really a sea change, I think, for that,
Yeah, I mean, internally we have sort of a rule that like Howard is the only source of truth, right? Like that's how we work, and then we work outwards from there. It's like if you need more information, it's fine to go pastiche, right? Because we're building a world, a universe, right, for people to live in. And Howard, he mentions things, he doesn't always go into detail, right? So we go wider. So we sort of, Howard is primary source, then we go secondary source like pastiche, and then we go to like the RPG books as a third source as well, and see what other people have thought and how they've interpreted things. So we approach it that way when we're building. But it's kind of always been the core for us that Howard is like the source of truth for this.
I've often wondered, I mentioned that Age of Conan was mentioned on The Big Bang Theory, but also Robert E. Howard was name-checked when Sheldon said that's the Age of Conan based on the Conan character created by Robert E. Howard, and so Howard got big props right there on national TV with a big show, and I've often wondered if they could track how the game advanced, maybe just from that mention.
I would just say anecdotally, people came up to me after, because in my small circle I'm known as the Conan guy.
So are we all.
Yeah, I feel like everyone knows that, but they were like, "Oh, that's the game from Big Bang Theory," and I was like, "I hate that show, so I don't know." But yeah, I mean, I think that definitely it rang out a bit. It had to, right?
Yeah, totally. Well, and it should be noted that Sheldon is a Texan, so representing the home state. So I don't think Bill Prady had that in mind. I think he just wanted a cool game. But I'll take it. So that game ran. The other thing about this was the longevity of the MMO at a time when there was a 1 to 2 year turn on this stuff. This ran through several expansions and even spawned a spinoff.
Well, it's still running.
Yeah,
It hasn't gone anywhere.
yeah,
It's still running. Age of Conan Unchained is still there, free to play.
yeah.
And
When did it go free to play? That was the other big deal. Yeah,
2012, 13.
yeah,
Yeah.
It's been available for everybody for a while, which is pretty awesome.
You're still putting out a bit of content too.
It has the
not
best video game score ever. Like, the score is just beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah.
The score for this game is just gorgeous. I put it on at home and just listen to it because
It's a Norwegian composer, and what's his last name?
Knut
Hagen. Avenstrup.
Avenstrup.
Avenstrup, yeah. Anyway, he actually recorded the initial score with Oslo Symphonic Orchestra, or maybe it was even the London Symphonic. And for the Rise of the Godslayer expansion, which took the world into Kitai and explored that whole eastern region, he studied intensely and brought in Asian musicians with their special instruments to get the vibe and the feel. So I agree, it's one of the best game scores, and I can listen to those just sampling and just let them run. It's a beautiful, beautiful score.
Okay. Oh yeah. Now this next thing was the next big deal. A board game, a large scale strategy board game. Fred, was that you guys again?
Yeah, this is one of the first guys we approached. I'll talk a little bit more about that tonight, but was, of course, in the quest for gamification. An old associate friend, an Italian distributor and publisher, now known as Aris, then known as Nexus. He went on to, after this, do War of the Ring, big game. But he was a big Conan fan, and his group, and this is Roberto Di Meglio from Italy. So it took quite a few years for them to do the game, though. I think this was already planned for 2004 or 5.
Well, it's a gorgeous game. It's I guess what we call Euro game style game, which means nice. They've got high-end components. They've got beautiful artwork. It's a gorgeous production, and it tends to be a little bit more complicated in terms of execution. It's not a Monopoly setup or anything like that, or even Risk. I mean, there's it's a layered game that actually does a really nice job of simulating the politics of the different kingdoms in a really cool way, where you're going to
You have Conan kind of wandering the land, and you vie for control of him, right?
Yeah.
And then that helps to swing the balance, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, he's literally the agent of change in your setups. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I have the game in my car. If anybody wants to look at it later on, I'd be glad to demo it.
At the pavilion later on, if anybody wants to do a pickup game, we've got a taker here. So, yeah, let's move on. Munchkin Conan. Is Bob here? No. There he is. Yeah. Bob, would you like to say something about this?
I've got Munchkin Legends, and that may be over in the library. Munchkin, if you've never played it, it's a game where you both compete and you cooperate, and there's lots of humor. And I compare it to, you can basically set someone on fire and then say, I've got a fire extinguisher if you would like to. You get a reward for it. And it's a help and stab in the back at the same time to get to level 10. And it's a card game. It's very sarcastic. It's very funny. They've done 500 iterations of Munchkin. And one was Conan, so they did Conan theme and Conan humor, and people can get mad during Munchkin, but it's a lot of fun, and if you like whatever the theme is, as with Conan, you'll have more fun playing that than any other kind of game like that.
So I think, and Jay, you worked on this deal with Steve Jackson, and I have a feeling, and you can say yes or no, that this was actually the first licensed IP for Munchkin. Okay. So then after that, then they opened the floodgates. But Conan was again the first.
I got to play this game at a thing called Fables Con, which was a convention centered around Bill Willingham's comic book Fables. He threw a convention in Minnesota in February, so that was smart. But one of the things we had to sign up for was an hour of time at the bar. That was all the guests were required to do that. And I wasn't 10 feet inside the bar when a group of people grabbed me and said, we're so glad that we found out you're here because we want you to play Conan Munchkin. And I went, Conan what? I didn't know that it had come out. And so they sat me down and we played Conan Munchkin together. And they were just grinning from ear to ear. They were so excited to be playing Conan Munchkin with me. And that's actually one of my favorite gaming experiences was, and these were strange. They just knew me and knew
You were the Conan guy.
I was the Conan guy, and so they thought this would be a cool thing to do. So I'm hoping that they're still dining out on that story. They probably aren't. All right, are we to the yeah, okay. So Monolith, was this kickstarting?
Heck yes.
Yeah, that's
Big.
right.
It was at the sort of, when Kickstarter started to blow up for board games, this was one of the big ones. And then at the same time, Blood Rage was, I think, finishing. And so those two exploded. And I mean, it's still kicking.
Yeah, the game. It's a different game than the earlier board game. It's in that it's more skirmish based, which I wonder aloud if that was in an attempt to sort of maybe not ape the Hero Quest vibe, but to sort of ride that that feeling.
Oh yeah, I mean, definitely there was influences of that at the beginning. I mean, even from having the 3D doors and things like that.
Right.
It plays significantly different.
Sure.
And it's actually less skirmishy than it seems. It's very scenario-based.
Mm-hmm.
So, and from a design standpoint, I'm sure we'll talk about this more on tomorrow's panel, but it's beautiful because each scenario is kind of a blank slate. You've got the rules that govern it, but you can make a mini game however you want.
Yeah.
So each one can be exciting and as on brand as you want it. I'm biased too from my work. I didn't write the game or anything, but it's still a total joy every time you play it. And even people who don't board game, it's easy to pick up. And when they play that game, the excitement is always there.
It's a beautiful production too. It's gorgeous minis, beautiful character designs. And again, more high-end artwork, which is one of the things that I'm so grateful for in this modern era, is the availability of amazing artists who really are inspired by this source material that they can, I think they consistently turn in their best work when they work on these properties, personally.
Yeah, and that one was mostly Adrian Smith, who's really famous from his Warhammer work.
Yeah, the Warhammer stuff.
Yeah, and he created some truly classic Conan pieces and depictions.
Yes. Very
There,
much.
there was a pun there.
As a sideline, we had Adrian as a full-time staff artist when we did, in the old Target games, we did Chronopia. And that studio, when they defaulted, that's when Adrian started working for Workshop. So his early Chronopia work is where he cut his teeth. Of course, he's changed, his style is very different now, but it's still there. I think, to me, having seen all these 20 years of working with Conan partners and licensees and the creative teams, is that artists they're approaching Conan with trepidation because they're such massive fans of whether that is Barry Windsor-Smith or John Buscema or Frazetta,
Right.
that it's like I don't know, it's like dating your best friend's mother or something. They're super afraid. So you know, this is a through line. And here's the interesting thing: as they then progress, I've met several artists. One of them is like Patch Searcher. They go to the other Howard characters because they all read Howard, Conan, and they say, "Wow!" This is and then they start reading whether that's Solomon Kane or El Barak or you know, and all of a sudden they go, "I'm doing an El Barak here. Would you like?" So it is really infatuating how Howard's work is influencing them.
Well, okay, so the next big thing after the board game is I think it's probably the largest role-playing release for a game line. Well, I think Mongoose had more stuff. They were around longer. But this was another thing that was kickstarted, and this was significant as well because we hadn't had a tabletop role-playing game for a while, and right away they were really intent on kind of embracing the Funcom model, which is, you know, we're doing Howard's Conan, and so this was significant because Patrice Lounet and Jeff Shanks were brought in early on to consult, and they talked to me about some stuff. I ended up doing some things at the end, doing some proofreading for them, but also writing. And the goal for this was we want to use Howard's material only. And Jeff did a cool thing, I think. He said this is the chance to actually take some of the new scholarship and insert it. Because right up through the last of the Mongoose stuff, they were still drawing things out of the saga and using other people's bits and pieces to make this. And so the edict became, you know, we don't want to make the same mistakes other people have made. We want to make all new mistakes. And so that's when Zamora City became Zamora, and not Arjuan or, you know, Shadazar or anything like that. There was a lot of little stuff that got dialed back to Howard's original material. The Hyborian Age essay got utilized, and whenever we had to make something up that needed to be made up, the first thing that we did was, can we find an analog in some of Howard's other work? Is there some, you know, can we sort of reverse engineer this to figure out where some of this needs to be? In some cases, I took the Black Stone all the way back to the Hyborian Age to get to that. So everybody did this to various degrees, and I think what's nice about it is this is, I think, the most accurate.
Yeah, and they leaned into the crossover element too, where they brought in Lovecraft explicitly, wove that into it, and then of course there's the crossover books and all that jazz too. But I got to mention, to be fair, Patrice, you were involved in the board game as well, and it did start there too. There's no pastiche material,
right.
None of the decamped stuff. Yeah. I just had to clarify, or I'd have my head cut off.
No, that's okay. So I worked on one of the books for the line. Jeb over here, raise your hand, Jeb. Jeb worked on the line. Matt, you worked on stuff there as well. Is anybody else here worked on the Modiphius stuff? Well, if you want to come talk to us about it, we all have stories. So
that was my in. Like I work for Monolith now, but my first project was Chris Birch, the publisher, wanted to do the crossover stuff, and they had announced they were going to do a board game crossover book, and I was like, who's doing that? Because I had a prototype from the board game where I was working on a scenario like more of a fan thing, right? And so that book kind of developed over time, and we were deciding, how do you do it? What are we going to include? And eventually it's where we launched the solo co-op mode for the board game. So I wrote that up, and it worked, and people seemed to like it. But the crossover element was cool, because that was a new thing. We started to take, there was the Exiles source book, which I worked on. Age of Conan is still, that book is still not out, so Age of Conan is truly not dead.
It'll
never die.
Any day now.
It's nice to see how when early on, when Gary Gygax was influenced by Robert E. Howard, and the elements were there in the original D&D, but it's nice to see how it's come full circle, and now we have a real game, really based on the works of Robert E. Howard. You know, so his influence has been 50-some years now, over that, and it's so nice to see, and it's so nice that it's gotten such a good reception, and it's all due to Robert E. Howard.
That's right. We're right at the edge of it, so I think we're going to cut it here. Oh yeah, well, and can you hit us with Conan Exiles?
Sure. I've got it in my bag. Do you want me to hit it? No,
Yes.
I'm good. Just in brief, Conan Exiles was, well, it was our return to Conan after we'd done Age of Conan. The survival gaming genre, I don't know, how much people know about gaming, but the survival gaming genre was this new offshoot. Kind of Minecraft is this huge game, and there's a lot of kids who've grown up playing Minecraft, and then the survival game is kind of a subgenre of Minecraft, where it's like, if you don't eat, drink, and survive, you die, and and we wanted to make a survival game, and obviously we went straight to the IP that we know and love, which was Howard and Conan, and we thought that, like, how do we make the player fantasy of being a barbarian, and Conan's journey is so good because it's barbarian to king, right? So it's such an obvious journey for us to recreate in the game. So we kind of always said, like, you start with nothing, starving in the desert, no food, no water, crucified, just like he is in Which Shall Be Born, and then as a player you mimic that journey. You have to survive however you can, and then eventually you come to the top and realize that maybe it wasn't worth it after all, but that's a different question.
Folks, we've got a lot more gaming stuff to talk about, and so hopefully you'll be around for the rest of tonight and tomorrow. We are available whenever we're not on panels, so please come up and introduce yourselves and say hi, and we'll be happy to chat with you about all this. Thank you for being here. Enjoy the rest of Howard Days.